I think, therefore I am. But I'm thinking all the time, and I don't know who I am. Am I? Are you? I'm in the middle of nowhere, and it's a good place to be. Welcome to Just Nowhere with Dr. Samuel Zinner. Hello, everybody. Tonight, I'm joined by Professor Michael Knowles of McMaster Divinity College in Hamilton, Ontario. Welcome, Michael.
Hello. Nice to be with you.
Yes, it's a pleasure. All right. We've been in contact for a while over some really fascinating material that you've discovered relating to the Hebrew Bible. So let's just get right into this. You can go into as much detail or keep it as general as you wish, but what have you uncovered?
Well, it's really quite fascinating. Perhaps those who are logging in will know about gematria, that every word in Hebrew has a specific numerical value. And divine names in particular have specific values. The value of the word El, Aleph Lamed, is 31, Yahweh is 26. And what I've discovered, somewhat to my surprise, is that specific divine names and name-based formulas within the text, within a particular book, within a particular section of the canon, the frequency with which those names occur is typically governed by numerical values derived from divine names themselves. Let me give you an example.
Sure.
The tetragram, Yahweh, it occurs 26 times in Joel. That's the value of the name. It occurs 52 times in Amos. As an individual, that's twice 26. As an individual lexeme, part of both single and compound divine names, it appears 26 times in Jonah. Here's a really interesting one. I said that the value of the name El, Aleph Lamed, is 31.
Yes. Well,
that lexeme occurs 309 times throughout the canon as a whole, but Daniel 11:36 has a reduplicated form, El Elim, in which case that word occurs 310 times in the canon, 10 times its value. Or here's another one that's really kind of interesting. Elohim. Elohim can be spelled in its full sense or in its full spelling with an extra vav, or it can be spelled in what's called a defective spelling, 2,600 times. That's 100 times the value of Yahweh, actually. So they kind of mix and match. So that's frequency. But going with it is what's even more fascinating, to take this one step further, is that the position, if you take all the divine names in a given book, or even in a section of the canon, you just isolate them, and then you plot where the rare or infrequent names occur. So here's an example. The name Adonai, Lord, in its full spelling with the Vav occurs exactly once in the entire canon with reference to God. Judges 13:8. Okay, so there are 248 divine names in Judges. That's 31 times 8, well, full of the value of El. But Adonai, spelled plain A, only time in the canon, is 71st from the end of that collection. And the value of Adonai, spelled plain A, is 71. Or here's a really interesting one. Leviticus, book of Leviticus, or the Torah. Leviticus, the tetragram occurs as a single element divine name. Yahweh occurs 285 times. And in that collection, there is exactly one reference to the name of Yahweh, Shem Yahweh. It is 260th from the start and 26th from the end.
Fascinating.
I know, tell me that's an accident. It's clearly not. Now, it gets even funkier. Now, most of these, I've discovered, not scores, but hundreds of such examples, some clearer, some perhaps less persuasive.
Sure.
So the distribution of infrequent forms happens at numerically, symbolically significant junctures with respect to other divine names and with respect to verse structure. So we'll just leave that going. But the one further dimension of this, there's a fourth dimension to it, which is that sometimes onomastic values, numerical values derived from divine names, also order the narrative itself. So here's an example. Numbers 7 describes in mind-numbing detail all of the sacrifices that are offered at the dedication of the altar in the tabernacle.
Yes.
And if you have a, pedantic turn of mind, as clearly I do, and you count up the number of sacrificial animals, there are 252 animals sacrificed in the course of 7 days by the 12 tribes. And if you add up the shekel weight provided in the text for all of the vessels, the bowls and the platters, it's 2,520 shekels. That's 10 times as much.
Right.
Well, 252 is the numerical value of the name El Elyon, God Most High.
Yes, that's right.
It's quite
yes.
striking. And that happened, or when the exiles arrive in Jerusalem in Ezra chapter 8, they offer a total of 197 animals. Why would you come up with 100? Well, that's 197 is the numerical value of the cognate form El Elyon, not Elohim Elyon, but El Elyon.
Mm-hmm. Right,
So
right.
this kind of stuff occurs in narrative as well as underneath the surface of the text. So this stuff has fascinated me for a number of years, and as you can imagine, it takes a whole lot of digging to pull this stuff out. And frankly, not every example is as persuasive as
Of course.
As these ones. But
Right.
these are the ones I want to kind of start with, because I think they're the ones that demonstrate the validity of the hypothesis.
Yes, very important to start with, right, the strongest evidence, because as you know, right, we're all taught, right, in higher education when it comes to this topic that, right, there was no gematria in Israel in the time of the Hebrew Bible, that this comes later in the Hellenistic period, right?
Yeah.
And this evidence is so convincing.
Yes.
Right. It's about time for the consensus to be turned around.
I think so. Now, there is a small group of scholars, people like Patrick Scahan and Addison Wright. Patrick Scahan pointed out that there are 375 proverbs attributed to Solomon. Well, 375 is the numerical value of Shlomo,
That's
the name
right,
Solomon
yes.
in Hebrew. Or Addison Wright figured out the structure of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, in multiples of 37, which is the value of the name vanity. All is vanity. So in other words, I think there's, even apart from divine names, there is a small but I think growing group of scholars who are able to, who are doing rigorous research and are able to see that, in fact, you're right, gematria functions very much within the biblical text.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Yeah, those authorities that you mentioned, who've looked into Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, they're known to me, and they're very respected. These are very respected academic studies. There have been others in academia whose work has not impressed me as much. So they're like strengths and weaknesses, right, in the historiography leading up to this point. And you've mentioned you started with, some of the most persuasive and strong cases. Well, that then, of course, leads to the question, well, what about, the ones that are not as persuasive? So how do you try to distinguish between randomness and intentional patterns?
Well, I think that intellectual honesty compels us to say that sometimes you can't tell.
Yes.
This looks plausible, and we put it as a plausible hypothesis and claim no more than that for it. But the kind of things that I find most compelling are what I would call intrinsic correlation.
All right.
The name Yahweh occurs 26 times in a book.
Yes.
The position of Adonai, spelled plain, is the 71st,
Yeah, that's
which
an
is its
amazing
value.
one.
So yeah, that's stunning, right?
Yeah.
And so so most clearly, I'm interested in where the frequency or position of a particular divine name corresponds to the name itself, and those are the ones I love most. But beyond that, I think that if we stick to single whole multiples, if we stick to higher order multiples, because within a given set of 1,000 or 500, the larger the multiple, the less frequently it's going to occur at random. So if you look for multiples of 252 in a set of 1,000, you can only have 3 of those at random.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so, I confess freely, I'm not a statistician, but I think we can mitigate the randomness by emphasizing, on the one hand, those examples that are more compelling, and conversely, by freely conceding that in many instances we can't tell for sure. But once we've established the methodology on the basis of the clearer and more compelling examples, I think that gives us permission to offer other examples as reasonable probabilities.
Yes, or even from probabilities to, on the lower scale, possibilities.
Possibilities.
And yes,
possibilities.
and just. Yes.
And it's important not to claim too much. The other thing that's really important here, I think, is rigorous methodology. So without mentioning some names, without mentioning too many names, I mean, one of the things that I think in some circles has brought this kind of approach into disrepute is that there have been one or two, well-published researchers whose methodology is pretty loose, kind of fuzzy, And so I think that a rigorous methodology, always pursuing the same method of analysis, I think goes a long way to kind of enhancing the validity of the project.
Yes. Before I continue, I can't help but tell you, you mentioned 248 earlier. Do you recall which specific example that was?
I will look for it. 248 divine names in Judges. Yes.
Probably just a coincidence. And so this is a good example of, having to concede some things may be random, but 248, of course, is the numerical value in Hebrew of the name Avraham or Abraham.
Yes.
Right.
So again, if you have Shlomo, so you never know. I mean, I think that what the position we have to come to is acknowledging the importance of mathematical calculation in the ancient world.
Yes.
You will know better than I the work of the idealist philosopher Ernst Cassirer, who contends that number in the ancient world is not a matter of calculation; it's a matter of mysticism. The fact that there is numerical order has a theological or divine component to it, and I really think that's what's going on here.
Yeah, well, that reminds me of an example I heard of recently. I forget where it is, but shame on me. It's a famous passage in the Bible. There's a list of 3 Israelite kings, and the number of the men in each of their armies.
Yes.
Right. And so the first king was probably a good king, but there's a certain number listed. And the next king was a good king. And so the number of his men in the army is double, right? The one before, which I believe was a bad king, right? So the bad king gets the least number. But the third king, very righteous. So he has 1,060,000, I believe, which is just historically preposterous, but it all makes sense, right? When one realizes that 1,060,000 is actually double of the previous 2 figures, the sum of them. And so it's a literary convention, never meant to be taken statistically, but as a symbol for, hey, the bigger the number, the more righteous the king was, so he was more blessed.
And that's how numbers work. Now, there are historical examples because I think it's in, oh gosh, is this also in Numbers? Anyway, somewhere. There's a list of the number of, it must actually be in Joshua, the number of kings. There's this weird list of how many kings did they kick out of the land of Canaan. And it lists them one at a time. This king won, this king won. And it's like, okay, dude, we can count. But it lists, and then it says at the end very clearly, 31 kings. And it's like, why would it be 31? Well, because 31 is the value of the name El. And El is the name of the head of the Canaanite pantheon. And what we're really saying is, in defeating 31 kings, we didn't just defeat the king, we defeated the king's gods.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a supreme God. So I think that kind of stuff as literary motif and theological implication is happening pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, it's a good example of how we can classify or categorize or see what should belong to the strong cases, and that is, you'll have some kind of congruence between these numbers and the subjects or topics of the actual text, right? And so the example I gave earlier, as far as I know, I mean, I wouldn't see the relevance of the patriarch Abraham in the book of Judges. So it's probably just coincidence that
so here's the
Abraham
thing.
is 248.
Yeah, I think it works on multiple levels, because there are many examples in the narrative itself, but the role of a scribe is by definition secret. It's not meant for the normal reader. And counting letters and numbers and words and counting stuff in the verses, rather, in the text, is counterintuitive. It's not how you read texts. One reads texts as a whole, but to count individual. So this is actually it is secret and hidden precisely because this is a scribal craft.
Yes, an elitist.
Absolutely.
Technique, yes.
Yeah, I think the god of the scribes in Mesopotamian lore is Nabu, the keeper of secrets, if I remember correctly. And that's just how it works.
Right. Yeah, they were as far as education, reading, writing. Yes, these were the elites.
Yes,
and right. So they would know, for instance, the numerical values of the various divine names, right?
Yes.
Whereas the average person coming into the temple, I'm talking about the Jewish the temple in Jerusalem, right, would have no clue, right? But the scribes, right, would let's say, non-pejorative sense, pride themselves in having access to this secret knowledge.
That's right. That's right.
And I believe it was Ferdinand de Saussure, the 19th century French linguist and semiotician, right, who thought that some of the letter patterns he was detecting in ancient poetry, which seemed to cluster around the occurrence of names, right? That maybe that had something to do with the ancient idea that if you knew the name, if you knew someone's name, you then had power over it. So there's something even on a divine level, theurgical maybe, going on with interest in divine names and letter patterns. Of course, he wasn't into the number patterns, but just simply letter patterns. Like
that makes perfect sense.
He noticed that, like in the Iliad, there's a certain passage where suddenly Agamemnon, the name Agamemnon occurs, right? It's a scene for that hero. But right before and right after the appearance of the name, the phonemes of the name begin to proliferate, right? And then when the scene changes, right, it fizzles out, and some other new proliferation of phonemes and letters begins. And so he called it it's called the Saussure anagram. So it's anagram theory, which he never published because he could never figure out if it was random or not.
That's interesting. Now, I tell you what, so now that we're talking about other cultures, whether Hellenistic culture or Mesopotamian culture, a scholar named Stephen Lieberman, back in 1987, published a long and difficult article in the Hebrew Union College Annual, in which he proposed actually that gematria originates in Mesopotamia.
Oh, yes,
he didn't make this link specific, but it turns out that it is the Mesopotamians who assign numbers to the names of their gods. And he has in that article actually examples of number games that are going on with the numbers associated with particular deities. So we don't even have to contend that the Israelites, the ancient Jews, invented this on their own. I actually think it's much more plausible that they picked this up from the Babylonians and basically did anything you can do, I can do better.
Yes. Well, it as an analog to that, right? I assume, right, when you went through training, when I took religion courses, we were always told that in contrast to the other ancient Near Eastern societies, see in the Hebrew Bible, we see no evidence. There was no belief in, let's say, what we call a detachable soul from the body, let's say at the time of death. But SBL, one can find this as a free PDF on the SBL website. Richard Steiner wrote a book. It has this very challenging subtitle, and I forget the title of it, but a simple search, right? Soul and Richard Steiner on SBL website will get it to you. And it's a monograph long study showing very, very convincingly that the Hebrew Bible does, right, have instances, many instances of this ancient belief in the detachable soul, right, from the body. And my point here is, well, yes, all their neighbors had this belief. Why would they be an exception? Well,
exactly.
All the neighbors of the Israelites practiced gematria. Kings were building walls and palaces according to the gematria values of their names.
Yes.
Right? And so why would we suspect that only Israel, right, would not avail themselves of this or be totally ignorant of it?
Well, I think this is where methodology becomes really important, because I think
yes.
Bible code stuff, people are very nervous of Bible code stuff.
Of course.
And rightly so.
Yes.
And so it becomes important that we, establish a kind of a methodology in a historical setting and be able to demonstrate precisely that this is not a one-off thing, and to be able to locate numerical calculation in the text, in the scribal culture, and in the normal functioning of scribes. All of a sudden, you know that you're not just imposing it, fantasizing about trying to find something there.
Right. That's why I call these, for myself at least, I call these scribal techniques.
Yes,
they're not proof of supernatural interventions or anything like that. This is an academic topic, and it needs to be approached that way without any of the sensationalism of the Bible codes and prophecies hidden. I remember one time we called it the Seneca table, right? When I was at the University of Nebraska in grad school, every Friday, the classics students, right, would gather together at a local bar. So John Turner and other people were always there eating popcorn and whatever. And one time this student, this young lady, asked me, Samuel, do you believe in the Bible code? And I said, well, yes, I do. And I also believe in the Moby Dick code. These random patterns can be found anywhere given a sufficient length of text.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. It's the same thing with a sufficient length of numbers or digits. Right. We can find not anything, but just about.
Well, as somebody once said, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess.
Yes. But anyway, I can't emphasize enough how much I admire your methodology that you've developed. And
thank you.
Yeah, and it's also, it's well known, for instance, for let's say letter patterns like acrostics or acronyms, that when we find something like this, it really does help. And it really does increase the, at least, appearance of intentionality when there is some actual connection with the surtext or the open text, right, within which this acronym or acrostic occurs. Right.
So now the question is going to emerge. Okay, so then, why would they do this? What's their motive? What is actually going on? Are they just playing number games because they're bored and they have nothing else to do? And I think
what's your theory?
So my theory is, funny you should ask. So I distinguish between what I call typological values and onomastic values. So typological values, 7, because there's 7 wandering stars. 10 because there are 10 digits, 12 because there are approximately 12 lunar months in the year, 40 because 40, remember, ancient peoples are keen observers of the natural world, 40 weeks of gestation before life occurs. So that's why it's always a time period. Those are typological values. So we know that they intensely we know they intensely scrutinize the cosmos.
Yes.
Well, it then becomes a matter of being able to read the sacred text the same way that you read the cosmos, that you discern the numerical structure that the creator has embedded within the creation or within the sacred text. Now, of course, in one case, it's manifestly the work of a scribe, but it's a sacralizing of the text itself. So, and what's more interesting is that in traditional classic Hebrew rabbinic thought anyway, Hebrew is actually the language of creation. So God speaks numerical value into the cosmos. God speaks in God's word numerical values and the value of the divine names into the biblical text. So if the cosmos is fashioned and ordered and given value by the divine speech, so numerical patterning is intrinsic to the sacredness of the text and the sacredness of the cosmos as a whole. They both work by the same principle. And so it's, I think, at that level of theological integration that all of a sudden, okay, now it makes sense. They're not doing it just for fun, but let's grant that not everybody agrees about what values are even in creation. So, for example, here's a really interesting example that at Qumran and in the book of Jubilees and in the book of Enoch, there are 364 days in the year. And why is that important? Because 364 is a septenary, a septenary multiple of 26, the value of the name Yahweh.
Yes.
And so, not everybody agrees on how many days are in the year, but to give it a sacred value is a way of acknowledging your belief that God is the creator of all things. And so it actually only stands to theological reason that you would find numerical patterns embedded in the text by the scribes because they're honoring the text the way they honor creation as a whole.
Yeah, I've argued that the reason, well, one of the reasons, let's not be reductive, but one of the reasons the Qumranites and other groups like them had this 364 day solar year was precisely because of the tie-in with the numerical value of the tetragrammaton. But that's why they were so sensitive about fooling around with the sacred calendar, because you're fooling around with the numerical values of the divine names. So you have 4 seasons, 91 days each. Well, what's 91? That's the numerical value of Adonai plus Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. 26 plus 65 equals 91.
Exactly. And they're doing that stuff all the time. What's really interesting is I'm going to have this maybe partly wrong, but if I remember correctly, in Mesopotamian thinking, the ideal year until corrupted by sin and, fallibility, the ideal year is 360 days.
That's right. Yes.
And that makes sense too, because then all of your mathematics, function on a base 60, 360, so that again, every calculation with which you build and every way in which you see the heavens, it's all the same number. So in principle, the same thing is going on.
Well, as everyone will know, the 364 day year also overlaps with 365, because of the adjustments that happens now. So of course that brings to mind Genesis chapter 5 and Enoch or Henoch, who walked with God and he was not. But anyway, so he lives 365 years. All scholars, have known forever, Yeah, well, surely that's an allusion to the solar year, 365 years, 365 days, the solar year. Recently, I was looking at that passage, chapter 5, which is the 10 generations, of the genealogical list, famous genealogical list. And I thought, well, let's do this. Let's count the words, in the Masoretic text. So I was doing it. I was getting towards the end of the chapter, and I got up to something like 350 words, and I said, wait a minute. Is this going to be 365 words? And so I at that point, I actually looked at a database that my friend Keith Yoder developed, with all the word and letter counts, for the Torah. And I looked at it, and sure enough, there are 365 words in chapter 5 in that genealogical table.
Yeah.
And again, to me, it's like, yeah, self-evident. It's in there to esoterically point out the importance
Absolutely.
of Enoch in that table.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
But there you have a good example of how the open text, or what I like to call the surtext,
Yes.
in contrast to the subtext, the surtext, it ties in nicely with it. In fact,
Yeah.
quite startlingly, I was startled, right? And what I was startled about mostly was, this is nowhere in the literature. Why has no one noticed this?
Yeah. Well, again, I ran across a quote from somebody who said, that numerical calculations in scripture tend to attract crackpots. And so, and that is true. And we can all come up with examples of very bad methodology. And, these things we might say are indeed legion. But then I think that it does take a certain amount of courage and also very rigorous methodology in order to demonstrate just quietly and soberly that this is coherent. So in this case, that we have to be clear about how we designate literary units, because I could count up to 365 anywhere I wanted.
Yes,
but there has to be some recognizable way of saying, okay, that's a discrete literary unit, and that becomes important. One of the things along these lines, I don't have the numbers in my head at the moment, but one of the things that's really interesting throughout Torah is, particular speeches by particular figures, particular speech of Moses. Very often, if you say, cut off, and Moses said, you don't count that, that's the intro. But then you count the number of words that Moses, enunciates at a particularly important occasion. Often those are, again, multiples of onomastic values. And it's a way of saying this is a speech ordained, authorized, consecrated by God, or at least consecrated to God. In the very structure of the text, there is an acknowledgement of divine design.
Have you thought about the first account of creation of the book of Genesis, as far as your point about the structure of creation, being parallel to or analogous to these scribal techniques? Because, as is famously known, this is a story about 6 days plus 1 day of rest, and the first verse has 7 words, and it can go on from there. Have you used that?
I have
as
not,
an example?
although I'm trying to remember. I mean, I'm digging hard in a fading memory.
Because your point is supported right off the bat, right? The opening line of Genesis.
If I remember correctly, though, I think that the first mention of God, I could be wrong, I could be proven completely wrong here, but I think the first mention of God is the 26th word in Torah, 26th word from the beginning. That's the first mention. That can't be right. In the beginning,
no,
that can't be right. But anyway, my point is, no, I can't remember the details, and I haven't gone far into this.
Sure.
But absolutely, there are.
Well, 7 words right off the bat. Not only that, that verse in Hebrew divides cleanly, semantically in half, right? And and the first half, is 14 letters,
right,
and the second half is 14 letters.
Yes,
right.
So,
and
so the question then becomes, where does this end? And because you can count numbers, you can count letters, words, verses, because particularly in Psalms, for example, verse structure is intrinsic to the text itself. So, to be honest, I've limited myself as much as possible simply to enumerating divine names, because those are discrete sets.
Yes.
They're very easy to delineate. They're okay.
Sure.
Let's admit
I agree.
that, Adonai can refer to a human Lord, so you have to cut those out. So there are some questions you have to answer, but relatively speaking, those sets are easier to isolate, and patterns within them easier to demonstrate.
Yes. Well, yes, I was just indulging on Genesis simply because I like that, because it's the beginning of everything, and for me, it shows the interest in these number techniques that these scribes were employing. It's there are many things that could be mentioned about that, but the last point I will make is that that first creation account contains comprises 469 words, which is multiple of 7. It's 7 times 67. And so I think it's quite clear that there's this interest in literary numerical patterns in this story of creation. Right?
Because creation is numerically ordered. It's just that simple.
Yes.
What's really interesting, incidentally, we don't have to go too far down this road, but for instance, in the beginning was the logos. The Stoic notion that meaning, that there is an intrinsic meaningfulness to creation as a whole, and I think this is a direct correlate of that in Hebrew thought. Now, one of the things we were talking about before that you kind of challenged me with, and it's a really good question, is like, okay, well, how much of this is compositional? How much of this is redactional? Right. Remember, we kind of chatted about that a little bit. And that's a really tough one. That's a really tough one, because I think that retrospectively, you can't, do as they did at Jericho and, like take Tel Es Sultan and kind of dig down one layer at a time. It's all mixed together and really hard to see. But what you can see, I think it's possible at the very least to determine what patterns are less likely to be compositional and more likely to be redactional. Let me explain what I mean.
All right.
So the tetragram, Yod-He Vav-He, occurs 434 times in Ezekiel. That's 31 times 14. Half of those, 31 times 7, are Adonai Yahweh. They're multiples of 7 and 31. So that at least had to be established in the final form of the book. Is that compositional? How fully, were there stages of composition? We're not sure. How about this one? The lexeme, Yod-He Vav-He, Yahweh, occurs 1,820 times in the Pentateuch. Just look it up. Well, that's a multiple of 26, 26 times 70. It's a multiple of Adonai, the value of Adonai, 65.
Right.
65 times 7 times 4. And it's also, as you just mentioned, Adonai Yahweh or Yahweh Adonai, it's also a multiple of 91.
That's right. Yes.
This is like not an accident, but this has to have been established at the formation, at the stage that the Pentateuch itself was formed. Or as I mentioned earlier, Elohim occurs 2,600 times throughout the canon. Well, clearly, I think we have to assume that at redactional stages, there's some numerical awareness, but clearly it's governing larger redactional wholes.
Yes.
But here's one I found that I'm not entirely sure what to make of. So here's an interesting thing. If you count the number of verses, because when you get counting, you kind of count everything that moves and doesn't.
Sure.
Interestingly, there are exactly 1,500 verses in books 1 through 3 of the Psalter. 15.
All right.
15 is the numerical value of Yah, Yod-He.
Yes.
The name Yah. And so it is at least hypothetically possible that, if it is the case that the Psalter is built up a book at a time, or there is an incremental process, it's possible that there was a 3-book structure at one point that was given, assigned exactly 1,500 verses. Although that may not be so, because in order to form the books, there are added verses in various places. But it's an interesting hypothesis.
Yes. I've struggled with this. All scholars do who work with these ancient texts. For instance, the first 2 Psalms, Psalm 1 and Psalm 2. As they currently stand, I believe that they are a pair, a diptych. But is this compositional or redactional? I think most scholars believe Psalm 1 was composed separately and is later than Psalm 2. I don't know. I mean, every time I look into the matter, I can't be confident. It's like, I just can't know.
And there are several Psalms, as you know perfectly well, and others will know as well, that there are Psalms that, in some traditions, it's one Psalm, and in some traditions, it's two Psalms. Well, which was which? Or here's one that I discovered that's really fascinating. 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings have separate and combined numerical patterns. You can find, I think, quite strong evidence for numerical patterns that function in the separate halves of each book, and patterns that function across the book as a whole. I actually think that at a redactional stage, there is an acknowledgement of whole and part. Or more interestingly, the one that really kind of surprised me, because you would think this is merely modern scholarship, but the two halves of Zechariah have completely different numerical patterns. So that's not simply, it would appear, a modern scholarly construct, but rather something that scholars have said, no, legitimately, these are separate compositions that have been wed. And I think numerical symbolism confirms that judgment.
Right. Yeah, I was speaking with Keith Yoder yesterday about his stylometric analysis of Zechariah, and he says, yes, the final chapters, certainly they are different. There's a different way that the particles of language are used, the conjunctions and prepositions. So it bears out, the pre-computer age literary analysis, strictly literary analysis by scholars of Zechariah. Right.
Well, particularly when you think that that ancient scholars, in fact, modern rabbinic scholars, for us, we read the text and we try to remember it, and we look it up in computers, but they memorized the text.
That's right.
They actually knew the text, the entire text. They spent their lives swimming in it, and knew it intimately.
Yes. Well, I know of like the Book of the 12, or the so-called 12 minor prophets. Right. It's at least to those in the field, it's well known that there are lots of signs of what look like something happened at a redactional level when all 12 books were put together, because these different books have these very intriguing allusions to other prophets' names right? So the different prophets of the 12 prophets' names, right? There are allusions to them in books other than their own, right?
Yes, of course.
And many of them tend to have echoes of that famous Exodus 34:6, right? The Lord is merciful and gracious.
Yes,
it seems to be redactional as well.
Sure. Yeah. Now, there's an interest just on the way by. As you know well, the prophets are divided into former and latter prophets. There are, in fact, 15 latter prophets. I don't think that's accidental. There are 15 latter prophets because that is the numerical value of the name Yah.
Well, I've even noticed, of course, I don't push some of these because I'm very well aware, of the possibility of randomness, but I think some things at least deserve mention, right, as possibilities. But if one looks at the number of Psalms in each of the 5 books, I'm not going to go into the details, but to me it does look like
31s.
It looks like it's all about the numerical values of divine names.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Which book is it that has 31 Psalms? Again, once you are alert to it, you don't want to overreact by finding things where they aren't. Right. But when you have something that's clearly delineated as a single book of Psalms and it has 31 Psalms in it, then you say, well, okay, why would that be? Now, one of the mysteries, incidentally, is the number 17, because multiples of 17 turn up all over the place. And I know Caspar Labuschagne in particular spent a lot of energy trying to figure out, well, what divine name is that? And personally, I don't think there's a divine name behind it. I think it's, a multiple of, it's the additive result of 10 and 7, 2 typological numbers. And it's just held to be sacred in its own right because it's composed of sacred numbers. Again, we have to be careful about our methodology, but if you find a particular phenomenon and the other things are explained in this manner, well, then can we apply those explanations to this. And again, trying to manufacture a divine name that fits the number, it turns out to be a bit of a dodgy exercise. At least I haven't found it satisfying.
Yes. Well, yeah. I was for the longest time very. It was very dubious to me, this correlation between 17 and the Tetragrammaton.
Yeah.
But then recently, Israel Knowles
Okay.
published
Very,
an
very
article.
credible.
Yes, published an article on that very question, and so I'm more open to it now. But the problem. Not necessarily with that claim, but a methodological issue, let's say a methodological challenge is, as anyone who can do math knows, the more numbers you have as candidates, right, the more your chances of randomness increase, right?
I think
it's just a part of the game.
Yeah, I think that's a type 1 error. I think that's called. But now the article by Israel Knowles, it's kind of funny. My name's Michael Knowles. I haven't met Israel Knowles, but I hope to one day, and we'll have a laugh about this. It's really good to confess what you don't know. And I actually was not aware of that article. I would love to. I'll
send you a
copy.
I'll send you a copy.
Thank you.
And it is based on, it is congruent with a known system of gematria in the ancient world as attested in Greece. Right. And so I see no reason why it wouldn't have been operative in Israel as well. But, the methodological question is, why would there be more than one system used? Right.
Mm-hmm.
I've developed my own theory about that. I won't go into it right now. But, there has to be, it can't be random. One has to try to come up with criteria and rules. Why would different numerical systems be used, right? So that has to be met on head on, right? And people like Labenschanger never did that. They say, well, this number, agrees with the numerical value of this, and it's one gematria system, whereas this other number agrees with this other divine name via a different gematria system. Why? Why the different? So.
Sure.
I believe one can come up with, clear rules of what was going on, why there was this alternation.
Yes.
But my point here is that most of the people working on this topic, right, starting, what was it, maybe back in the 60s, maybe, people like Labenschanger and Klaus Schadl, they didn't seem to have developed a list of criteria and rules for a convincing scientific methodology. Right?
And Caspar Labenschanger in particular, when you read his articles, he tends to be actually quite impatient with people who disagree with him. And
but that's why we need humility.
We really do, and we need to go slowly and accept the critique, as take critiques very seriously.
Yes.
I think we have to go very slowly and acknowledge quite openly the difficulties or the challenges. Type 1 errors, for example. Randomness. How do you make sure it's not random?
Yes. Well, there are some, as we were talking earlier, there are some examples that I've come across that I categorized them with a word that I picked up from my friend Bernhard Long, right, at the University of Paderborn in Aarhus, and that is, well, that's intriguing. Right. So there are, which is, not pejorative. It's just, hey, that's intriguing. So
that's
it's
a definite maybe.
Yeah, it's a definite maybe. It should be kept in mind, and let's ponder this and look at it more. And one of those is, since we were talking about the Psalter, is Psalms 42 and 43. Right. So Psalm 42, of course, is begins the so-called Elohist Psalter.
Yeah.
And if you look at Psalm 42 and 43, it's pretty evident that's actually one psalm, which has been artificially divided into two.
Yeah.
And so why would that be? Well, I mean, this is intriguing. I don't know what to make of it. It's intriguing that, well, by doing that, the first integral unit ends really at Psalm 43, right? Which is half of 86. Elohim.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
You know, so,
Sure.
you know, maybe, you know, so I do suspect that maybe that's not it, but something numerical
Something like that.
was at
What,
work in that
so
artificial
what you're
division.
hinting at, what you're actually moving towards is actually a sacral vision of experience. And I think this is where it gets really, I think, compelling, that we're not actually talking about this example or that example, or whether, you know, that has its place. But I think we're actually talking about a way of perceiving the unity of all experience in a Hebrew worldview. That numeration and sacral numeration, numeration based on divine names, actually provides a clue to the sacred character of all experience. I mean, you know, it's hard to make us any larger claim than that, but I really think that's what we're talking about in the end, that we're learning to see the world in a mystical fashion with mystical numeration. And I think that's what we have to acknowledge, lest we get caught in arguments over the validity of this particular instance or that. But when we see this in, you know, the number of words in Genesis, the number of divine names in another book, the number of sacrifices offered somewhere, the way that the Psalter is organized, we begin to realize that this is an entire epistemology unto itself.
Yes, yes.
And what's fascinating, particularly for moderns, I mean this chronologically, is we function in a secular world, and it's fascinating to kind of be introduced to a sacral world, a God-soaked world. That this is a species of numerical devotion, a way of viewing the cosmos and creation as a whole as precisely the handiwork of God. And I think that's what the scribes were about. That's why they were doing this within the sacred text.
Yeah, that reminds me of years ago when I presented a lot of my findings, right, on these numerical patterns in the Hebrew Bible. Right, I passed them along to my friend Charles Hebroll, Rutgers University, to, you know, see what he would think, right? Because, you know, I'd never done this before, right? So, and he said, yeah, it's most of the stuff you're showing me, it's clearly this is intentional. But then he wrote in capital letters, but why?
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So that's the question has to be answered. And of course, you have this, which is this theory, which is very attractive. And what I like about it also is that I think that it has to do with, this is the way that the Hebrews recognized and in one sense imposed, right, a certain structure on the cosmos and on their experience, their life.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And,
it is meaning making.
As part of that, I would integrate my own theory. I think my theory is eminently integratable, if that's a word. Right. You know, I'm here in Italy, and English is not my first language for many, many years. So sometimes I make up words.
Oh, they're more fun anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, you know, it's very easy to integrate my theory into yours, and that is that. I developed this mostly from looking at the Psalter, right? So because these are prayers, right? And so then I you know, because early on I began to notice that this divine name in this particular psalm looks like it was placed as word 26 because, right, that's the numerical value of the tetragrammaton, et cetera, right? And so then I thought, so if I put myself in the mindset of these ancient composers who are scribes as well, right? It makes sense to me to ask the question, right? Would it have made sense to them to think this? And that is, all right, people are coming into the temple. They may hear the liturgy. They may hear this psalm being sung. And just by virtue of the surtext, you know, the words as such, you don't need to know anything about the literary structure or any hidden patterns in it, but this is going to be spiritually potent, right? As a prayer, especially because it has these powerful divine names in it. However, for the scribe knew, the composer would know, well, there's a second hidden layer of
Yes.
potency of these divine names,
Yes.
because these divine names are placed according to the numerical
Yes.
values of the names. So it has a little to do with a ritual use as well, right? Which
I
is
think you're completely
totally
right.
integratable with the structure, imposition and recognition, right, of life and the whole universe.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. So first, you're making me think of, this is a quote that in this article we're talking about. This is a quote from Felicia Waldman, and she's talking about the Pentateuch in particular, but I think it applies to the way numerical structure operates underneath the surface of the text. She writes, Torah's mystical sense is tightly linked to its being considered to be of divine origin. Regarded from this perspective, the sense cannot be communicated directly. It needs to be deciphered behind the appearance. Thus, what can be read in the Torah is just the surface layer, which once removed reveals an entire secondary world. And it's this secondary world we're talking about, that where the scribal world, the literati, those who are in the know, they know that there's a whole other level and multiple levels of things going on that precisely are resonant of divine design and honoring. I mean, who knew that math could be devotion? But quite seriously, that mathematical calculation is actually a species of adoration and consecration. That's what I find quite compelling about this.
Yeah, right. And that idea was circulating in the ancient world. We know it, right? From Pythagoras through the ancient Near East to Egypt, right? This, it's very well known.
The Wisdom of Solomon has this direct statement about that, about how the God has ordered all things according to number and measure.
Yes.
That's actually the fingerprints of the divine. That's really the level at which we're talking about this.
Right. Well, yeah, it makes sense. This all makes sense to me, and it's always impressed me, because then it makes another subject, right, that I've studied, and that is the history of Kabbalah in Judaism. It makes the emergence of that in the later period, at least as early as, let's say, the Sefer Yetzirah, and each scholar has their own opinion about the dating of that text. But it makes it more natural to see something like that emerging, right?
It doesn't emerge out of nowhere. It's simply a further development of something that's been intrinsic to the Hebraic ways of viewing the world.
And that text, incidentally, for those who are not aware of it, it's the basic vision of it, or paradigm in there, is that God has made all things, or we could say each entity in the universe comprises various combinations of the divine letters. The way we would think about atoms or particles, right, of matter. They were thinking of the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, and very quickly, right, there's the whole book is enigmatic, but some of it is somewhat lucid and clear. There seems to be this, there is this one place where it talks about the 22 letters of the alphabet. So how do these letters become generative? Well, you have to combine the 22 letters of the alphabet with the 3 unique letters of the Tetragrammaton, the Yod, He, Vav, without the duplicate Hey, right? So Yod, He, Vav are the 3 unique letters. So you have to use those 3 letters and and inject them into the 22, right? And then you go through different combinations, and that's how God produces all the entities of the universe. And so, and each letter, of course, has a numerical value. So we're talking lettrism and numerosity. We could put it that way. At the same time.
I think you invented a word, but it's a good one.
Yeah. Well, the lettrism actually is
the lettrism is a good one. Numerosity I've never heard before, but I'll go with it.
Numerosity. The reason I use that, I don't claim to credit for that one. We talk about number, which humans can deal with. But there's something more basic, which cognitive scientists and people in other fields call numerosity, and this is something that other animals can have a grasp on, like a gorilla or a dog may not be able to count, 1, 2, 3, but they can recognize, let's say, one group that is larger than the other, significantly larger, and this ability is called numerosity.
Okay.
And so applying it to that, right? So Sefer Yetzirah, right? So there's this interest in lettrism, but there's this interest in numerosity, and the reason I say numerosity is because there's something very basic going on there. It's just not an interest in, like the series of digits and numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but it's something very instinctual and basic going on, even more fundamental. And, like numerosity, there's this primal recognition, right, that there are patterns, and we may not know the details of the patterns, but we know the whole universe is structure and pattern, right? And so that's where they're coming from, I believe. And so it's good to know two things I'm taking away from this. I'm really impressed with your rigor, right? Because many people who become interested in this topic do. I mean, they don't seem to have the judgment on where to stop.
Yes.
Right. And because what I call it is my axiom is don't get too atomistic, right? Because it never stops. No,
it never stops. No, it's unending. That's true.
And so the further you go, the less confident you can be, statistically speaking, just from that level, right? And so you're rigorous on that respect. And the other thing I take away from this is that you have developed a theory about what I referred to as Charles Hebberol's capital uppercase WHY. Why?
Yes.
Right? Yes. Because we can seemingly forever just go through example after example after example and say, wow, that's neat. But why? Right.
Yeah,
and so
I think that's the more
really
important question.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the more that, at least my experience was, the more of these patterns I discovered, the bigger, the more forcefully I felt that question: why? What's going on here? Right. And so, I'm not quite sure. I think my basic intuition was that. I can't remember, we get these flashes, right? I'm sure you've experienced that, but it was something to do with this ancient belief that, right, if you know the name of something, you have power over it.
That's right.
Well, but then derived from that was this idea that, well, yes, if you say the name, you release the power of that name.
Yes.
All right. And so, well, so if you put it in a numerical position that agrees with its value, you have a double whammy, right? Double release of the spiritual potency of that divine name.
What's fascinating to me, of course, is that we're very aware of Hellenistic culture, Pythagoras, Euclid, the ancient Greek mathematicians were very aware of their versatility with numbers. And I'm wondering whether one of the outcomes of this general stream of inquiry will be a growing appreciation for the numerosity, the numerical literacy, if we can call it that, of other ancient peoples, ancient Jews in particular. I think that this astonishing facility. We see, in a sense, we can say it this way. We know about the Mesopotamians who did really astoundingly precise calculations of astronomical phenomena, and we know about the Greeks. And kind of sandwiched historically between the two of them are the Hebrews. And I think this is going to be the contribution of Hebrew culture to our understanding of number in the ancient world.
Well, it does seem to be ubiquitous this ancient penchant and this ancient interest in number. It makes sense, right? Because
Sure it does.
humans started to settle down in these city states, right, and develop agriculture and city states. And of course, this is where their numerical skills, right, but force of necessity were developed, right, for economics. And
Sure.
all the way back to the clay tablets is well known.
Yep. Sure.
Right. And so it would make sense that this interest in numbers, in the way that we've been talking about it, would not be, just the something that arose in just one or just a few of those types of cultures, right? It would begin to proliferate, I think, through cultural contact. And we know that scribes had international, quote unquote, contacts, and the royal courts would have scribes from other cultures, right? In the employ, right, for obvious reasons. Right?
So it's clear that this field of inquiry is not limited at all. It has all sorts of areas in which it would be quite legitimate to expand it, and I think we can look forward to more of that in years to come.
Yes, well, one place I've already gone is, right, I immediately thought, well, we got to check the Septuagint. Was there any mimicking going on? And I think I found quite a bit of evidence for that. And then the Latin Vulgate, right, which Jerome is translated from the Hebrew, right? I've since we spoke last time, I've had Keith Yoder actually create a searchable database of the Latin Vulgate. And so I've been working with that, and found some very interesting things, but I won't go into that. But I will mention with the Septuagint, the very first line of Genesis, it's already right in your face, just as it is in the Hebrew text. So it does seem like there's some mimicry that was going on, so that these scribes who translated from Hebrew into Greek actually knew these patterns and tried to mimic them. And just very briefly, right? So to review, right, if you go back to the Masoretic text, you see that first line, it's 7 words, which is very symbolic, but 14 plus 14 letters, and it divides cleanly, right, semantically. Well, in the Greek, it's a nice 10 words, which is a nice hint at Pythagoras, maybe, the sacred decad, because you don't have to translate it in 10 words. There were a few other ancient Greek translations that are markedly different, right, to the Septuagint, and that verse, is very dissimilar. But anyway, I forget who it was, Aquila, who translated it in Greek, and he even duplicated the et particle in Hebrew in the Greek. Anyway, the Septuagint of that first verse cleanly, evenly divides into 19 and 19 letters.
Interesting.
Right, so you get that it's even. So in the Hebrew, it's 14 plus 14, and because Greek is wordier, it's larger, but it's still it's a duplication. 19 times 19. Yeah, looks pretty amazing to me. Like a lot of care went into it. But anyway, yes, I think this can be extended to the Septuagint and also to the Latin Vulgate. I'll give one example of the Latin Vulgate in Genesis. It's some very strange things happen in the Vulgate, mysteries that scholars don't even talk about. For instance, why is it that where we find in the first paragraph, right, which is the first 5 verses of Genesis, the first traditional paragraph in a Torah scroll, there are 5 instances of the divine name Elohim. 2 of them drop out in the Latin Vulgate. So that we find 3 instances of Deus. I'm going to leave it at that. I won't point out what there is a significant numerical pattern at work there, I believe. But my point is this, that these oddities, right, of the Septuagint, but also of the Vulgate, should be, it's an open field. right? To investigate these, to see if some of these oddities can be explained by the necessity to make the text line up, right, and be congruent with some of this interest in the numerical values of divine names. Anyway, you've told me you're going to be presenting on this topic in the relatively near future. Can you fill us in on that?
Sure. I'm offering a paper, very brief. They've given me exactly 20 minutes, which is not very long, so I'm having to carve it down. But at SBL International in Pretoria in the first week of July. So,
excellent.
That'll be interesting. Yeah.
Yes. Do you have any more plans, any grander plans for this topic?
I have. I mean, that's the whole issue. These are just a foretaste of. I've been working on this material for 17 years, and so I actually have a complete monograph of fairly large, and it just becomes a matter of finding the appropriate editing and publication skills. Because of course, you know, when you present this, to describe it, it's quite frankly a little bit dull. But if you map this in tabular form, you can actually demonstrate, you know, for instantly recognizable fashion, a numerical pattern by simply producing a graph. And so I'm going to have to find a publisher who's willing to do the tabular, the graphic work as well. So yes, I have lots of stuff now. And having completed a kind of a general theoretical work, I'm now working through, I've completed a study of Torah, each of the 5 books in Torah, and each of the books in the former prophets. Then I'll go on to the latter prophets. I have a first draft of that, and then the Ketuvim, the writings. So absolutely, there's lots more where this, lots more to come, but we'll just have to look forward to the right opportunity for publication, but we'll see how that comes out.
Yes, well, all my best wishes, and I really appreciate your time, Michael.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation. I appreciate the invitation very much.
Oh, my pleasure.
All right. Thanks so much.
If you enjoyed the program, please consider supporting this channel with a donation through Patreon or PayPal. And don't forget to subscribe. Thank you.